It was silence that caught me first. That silence of the Boulder Mountains that seemed to seep in and clear your mind of any chaotic thoughts. So different from the constant noise of Denver. My name is Scott, I'm 25, and until 3 weeks ago my life was following exactly the path my father had laid out for me. Architecture school, internships at well-known companies, and soon a secure job at some traditional firm. Everything was perfectly planned, just like the meticulous projects he supervised on his international trips. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get more stories like this. When my dad announced he had to travel for a few weeks and that I'd be staying at Richard's house, his old co-worker, I never imagined it would be more than just a simple stay. "It'll be good for you to meet someone experienced in the field," he said in that tone that didn't allow any discussion. Richard's house was partly hidden among tall pine trees, almost as if it wanted to keep secrets. It was a wooden and stone building that seemed to hug the mountainside, with a wide porch offering an amazing view of Boulder way down below. Inside, the place reflected the man who lived there, organized but welcoming, with shelves full of technical books mixed with old novels and handmade furniture he put together himself. The walls displayed photos of restored historic buildings, projects Richard had worked on before stepping away from the corporate hustle. I soon realized that Richard, at 48, had a routine as solid as the foundations of the houses he restored. He'd wake up before sunrise, brew coffee with his French press, and watch the sunrise from the porch like it was a sacred ritual. Then he'd head off to his current project, a Victorian house in the historic center that was coming back to life under his skilled hands. He'd return at dusk, whip up something simple yet thoughtful for dinner, and spend the night lost in books or little projects in his basement workshop. On the third day, Richard invited me to join him at the Victorian house project. "If you're staying here, you'd better do something useful instead of just staring at your conceptual drawings all day," he said with a subtle smile that softened his words. The house was magnificent, even though it was peeling and abandoned. Richard handed me gloves and tools, and we started peeling off layers of old wallpaper. "Every layer tells a story," he explained, gently revealing 50s floral patterns hidden under Victorian stripes. His hands worked with precision and respect, as if the house were alive. "I think I get it," I replied, surprised by my own enthusiasm. "It's like a biography in textures and colors." Richard stopped, watching me with a fresh curiosity. "Exactly. Most people just see old walls." At that moment, something shifted between us. It wasn't about my dad's friend and the obedient son anymore. We were two people connected by a shared understanding. The next few days fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. I got up early to make coffee while Richard tidied up his tools. In the Victorian house, we worked side by side, discovering how naturally we complemented each other. His experience guiding my creativity, and my fresh perspective helping spot details even he, with all his know-how, sometimes overlooked. On Sundays, we hiked trails in the mountains. Richard knew paths that didn't show up on regular tourist maps, leading to breathtaking views. "How'd you find this place?" I asked on one of those hikes as we looked out over Boulder from a natural lookout. "After my divorce, I used to hike to clear my head," he replied, looking out at the horizon. "The higher I climbed, the more I understood who I really was." Those words hit me in a way I couldn't explain. Sitting there, we shared not just the view, but also our stories. Richard spoke about past projects and hard choices, and I admitted my doubts about following the path my father had planned. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm living my own life," I said, surprised by my own honesty, "or if I'm just meeting everyone else's expectations." Richard simply nodded, his eyes reflecting an understanding so deep it made me feel genuinely seen for the first time. By the third week, I started noticing things. I caught myself watching Richard when he wasn't looking. The way his hands worked the wood, the lines on his face that deepened when he smiled, the way the sunlight brought out the silver streaks in his dark hair. And that scared me. Richard was my dad's friend. He was older. He was a man. Each of those facts felt like a wall between us that I wasn't sure could be climbed. My dad's phone calls only made things worse. "Are you making good use of your time?" he'd ask, referring to the interviews he'd scheduled at traditional firms. His expectations weighed on me like a ton of bricks. The breaking point came on an ordinary afternoon. We were at the local market getting ingredients for dinner when I overheard whispers. "That's the kid staying with Miller. You know how these artsy types are. The looks from Jonathan and Margaret, Richard's neighbors, burned into my neck. We walked home in silence, the tension between us almost tangible. Maybe I should head back to Denver, I suggested over dinner while staring down at my plate. Richard set his fork down and studied me for what felt like an eternity. People are always going to talk, Scott. The question is whether it's worth paying attention. That night, lying in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. It wasn't just about town gossip. It was about realizing that maybe I didn't know myself as well as I thought. The following afternoon, I found myself drawing on the porch. They weren't the technical projects for school, but free sketches of the Victorian house we were restoring. I want to show you a place, Richard said, fiddling with the keys of his pickup truck between his fingers. Bring a jacket. It gets chilly up there when the sun starts to set. We drove in silence on ever narrower roads, climbing past the well-worn tourist trails. When the road ended, we continued on foot for about 20 minutes, with Richard leading the way, until we emerged onto a natural plateau that felt like it was floating above the world. Boulders spread out below like a tiny architectural model, wrapped in the golden glow of the Rockies. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. I found this place during my first year in Boulder, Richard explained, pulling a bottle of wine and 2 glasses from his backpack. I've never brought anyone here before. I took the glass he offered, feeling the weight of his confession. Why me? Richard stared at the horizon for a moment, his silhouette framed by the fiery sky. His eyes held more than the sunset when they finally met mine. Because you see beauty where others only see structure, he said softly, almost lost in the mountain wind. It's a rare gift. The wine danced on my tongue, hints of cherry and oak, with a touch of something I could hardly pinpoint, making every sensation more acute. Richard was close, his warmth palpable despite the cool breeze, his fingers holding the glass with care. Everything felt intensified. I've been thinking a lot, I said, surprising even myself with how bold I was being. About the spaces we live in, and the people who make us feel at home. My hand moved over the stone we were sitting on until my fingers brushed against his, a touch so light it could have been accidental, but charged with meaning. I felt his breath change, become shallower. The last rays of the sun lit up his face, highlighting every line, and his deep eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my heart race. There was an unspoken question hanging between us, a moment of choice that would change everything that followed. Scott. His whisper of my name felt both like a prayer and a warning. There are limits that once crossed. I know, I interrupted, never again as certain as I used to be. I'm tired of living within limits I didn't choose. The silence that followed was filled only by the wind and the distant flap of a falcon's wings. Then Richard raised his hand, and with a gentleness that belied his strength, touched my face, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw as if memorizing every detail. The ride back down the mountain was quiet, the air between us buzzing with unspoken possibilities. Every turn in the road seemed to draw us closer to an inevitable moment. The house door had barely closed behind us when I turned to Richard, closing the gap between our bodies with a decision that surprised us both. Our lips met in an urgent kiss, years of his restraint and months of my inner turmoil dissolving in the shared heat. His hands, which I'd seen working so carefully on old wood, now explored my body with a mix of reverence and a restrained desire. Every touch awakened sensations I never knew I had. "Are you sure?" he asked softly against my lips, pulling away just enough to see my eyes for confirmation. I answered by pulling him by his shirt and leading him toward the stairs, fumbling with buttons and feeling the texture of his skin under the fabric. We stumbled up the steps like teenagers, a nervous laugh slipping out when we almost fell. Richard's bedroom was exactly as I'd pictured in my sleepless nights, tidy and minimalist, with a big sturdy wooden bed he'd built himself. The curtains fluttered in the night breeze, and the rising moonlight spilled across the floor like silver water. In that dim light, Richard gently laid me on the sheets, as if I were a delicate project that needed all his attention. His eyes roamed my body with genuine admiration that made my skin tingle under his gaze. "You're beautiful," he whispered, and for the first time in my life, I truly believed it. His hands and lips began a careful exploration, finding spots that made me sigh and arch my back. Like a map being revealed section by section, every touch uncovered new sensations, every sigh spoke a new language between us. When his lips traveled down my chest, tracing bolder paths with every pass, I grabbed his hair, taken aback by the intensity of the pleasure. Richard knew exactly where to touch, how to touch, and when to pause in order to stretch out every sensation to its edge. His experience balanced my eagerness. Where I hesitated, he guided. Where I rushed, he slowed things down, creating a synchrony that felt timeless. When we finally came together completely, it was as if two streams merged into one. The wooden bed creaked rhythmically, marking the pace of our increasingly intense movements. Richard held my hips firmly enough to leave his mark, and I wrapped my legs around his waist, determined to leave no space between us. Our eyes stayed locked. The vulnerability of baring ourselves completely was nearly as intimate as our physical union. As the rhythm quickened, I realized I was exploring not just Richard's body, but also parts of myself I'd never known existed. Every moan, every instinctive movement revealed truths I'd kept hidden under layers of other people's expectations. When the peak hit us, it was like a powerful wave crashing against ancient rocks. Overwhelming, inevitable, transformative. I murmured Richard's name in awe while he held me tight, as if afraid I might vanish with the coming dawn. Afterward, we lay side by side on the bed, our heavy breaths slowly calming. The room that had always felt familiar now seemed like a new space, transformed by everything we'd shared. The silence that settled between us wasn't awkward. It was full of meanings not yet put into words. Richard's fingers drummed softly on my shoulder as he stared up at the ceiling, his thoughtful profile outlined in the moonlight. "This complicates things," he finally said, his deep voice echoing in the quiet room. I propped myself on one elbow to study his face, searching for any hint of regret. I found none, only genuine concern that touched me deeply. "Only if we let it," I replied, wanting to believe my own words. Richard smiled, a bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your dad has been my friend for 20 years, Scott. You're the same age he was when we first met." The mention of my dad shattered the momentary spell, dragging reality into the room like an unwelcome guest. Suddenly, I was plagued with thoughts about the consequences of what we'd done. My father's reaction, the town's judging eyes, my future in school and work. "I'm scared," I admitted, surprising us both with my blunt honesty. "Not because of what we did, but because now I clearly see who I am. And I'm not sure I have the courage to be that person in front of everyone else." Richard pulled me closer and kissed my forehead tenderly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Scott. It's about moving forward despite it." We slept entwined, as if our bodies didn't want to ever let go, even in sleep. For the first time in years, I didn't dream about falling short of expectations or a life that had been mapped out for me, just a deep, comforting darkness. But morning came with its own harsh reality. The phone in the kitchen rang while we made coffee in a comfortable silence, each shared glance carrying memories of the night before. It was my dad. "I'm coming back tomorrow," he announced bluntly. "Business wrapped up sooner than expected. I hope you're making good use of your time with Richard to network." As he rattled on about interviews he'd arranged for me at fancy Denver firms, I felt the familiar mask slip away. The obedient son, the promising successor, the bearer of the Evans legacy. Richard watched the change from across the table, his eyes catching every subtle shift in my posture and expression. "Sure, Dad. It's been educational," I replied automatically. After he hung up, I just stood there with the phone still in my hand, feeling it like a stranger's object I didn't know how to handle. Richard came over but kept a respectful distance that stung more than any harsh word. "He's coming back tomorrow," I said, almost unnecessarily. "He wants me to go back to Denver with him." Richard nodded slowly, his face a mask of calm that didn't hide the tension in his shoulders. "And what do you want, Scott?" That simple question, one no one had ever asked me before. What did I really want? After years of living the life someone else dictated, I wasn't even sure how to answer. "I don't know," I confessed, feeling both liberated and terrified by the raw truth. What happened between us was unplanned, I need time to think. The morning dragged on in a strange limbo. I packed my things methodically, each item stashed in my backpack, marking a step away from the life I'd temporarily left behind. Richard went out to run some errands in town, giving me space that I wasn't sure I even wanted. While I was folding shirts, my phone buzzed with a message from Alexander, a friend in Denver. "I saw your golden friend at Rainbow last night with a guy. I thought you'd be with him. Everything okay?" My stomach churned. Rainbow was a well-known gay bar in Boulder. Richard had gone out the night before while I was finishing up a college project. He said he was meeting a client but ended up coming back late, smelling faintly of alcohol. That sense of betrayal hit me hard, not because of the idea of Richard going to a gay bar, I'd already suspected that, but because it made me wonder if our night together was just some casual fun for him. A tired cliché, the older man experimenting with a naive young guy. The next hours blurred together in a jumble of conflicting emotions. When Richard returned in the middle of the afternoon, something in me had shifted. A defensive wall had sprung up, tall and impenetrable. "Your stuff's all packed," he observed, noticing the backpack waiting by the stairs. "Yes," I replied flatly. "I think it's best if I head back to Denver today. My dad's coming back tomorrow, and I have things to sort out." The confusion on his face was real. "I thought we'd talk more about us." "Is there even an us, Richard?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "Or am I just the latest in a string of flings?" His expression hardened, a flash of hurt quickly replaced by the calm facade I'd seen on our first meeting, that barrier he kept up between himself and the world. "I understand," he said simply, taking a step back. "I'll call you a taxi." As we waited on the porch, the silence between us felt as heavy as concrete. Part of me wanted to explain, to ask about the message, to give a chance to what we had shared. But fear was stronger. Fear of being vulnerable, of being rejected, of facing the consequences of really owning who I was. When the taxi arrived, Richard helped load my backpack into the trunk with clinical efficiency. At the very last moment, as I was getting into the car, he leaned out the window. "Whatever choices you make, Scott, I hope they're yours, not your dad's, not mine, yours." Without waiting for an answer, he turned and walked back into the house. I watched him shrink away in the rearview mirror as the taxi drove off along the winding road, taking me back to a life that suddenly didn't feel like mine anymore. At the bus station, I bought a ticket for Denver and, while waiting, scribbled a short note. "I needed space. I'm back in Denver. Thanks for everything. S." I asked an employee to deliver it to Richard's address. It felt cowardly and inadequate, but it was all I had in that moment of confusion. The bus left at dusk, leaving behind the mountains where, for a few weeks, I had met a version of myself I never thought possible. A version that was both frightening in its honesty and terrifying in what it meant, but truer than any version I had known before. The next 3 days in Denver turned into an exercise in self-deception. I slipped back into my old routine, reviewing projects for school, answering emails about job interviews, meeting Alexander for a dismal cup of coffee where I pretended to care about his tales of parties and conquests. But my mind kept drifting back to the mountains, to Richard. Every sketch I tried to do for my urban design class somehow morphed into images of the Victorian house we restored together. Every cup of coffee reminded me of those mornings on the porch watching the sunrise. On the second night, my dad returned, and he bombarded me with questions about my stay in Boulder. "Did Richard say anything about his restoration techniques? Did you guys discuss approaches to historical preservation? He has valuable contacts, you know." I answered mechanically, boiling 3 life-changing weeks down to surface-level technical details he wanted to hear. It worked. Satisfied with my professional-sounding responses, he quickly switched the topic to the interviews he'd arranged for me. "Grayson & Associates is especially interested. They start new grads with above-average salaries, and the career progression is excellent," he explained, pouring himself some whiskey. "In 5 years, you could be leading your own team." I watched his enthusiasm with growing bewilderment. It was like watching someone else's movie. This future he dreamt up seemed to belong to a stranger, not me. On the 3rd night, I couldn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, I got up and started drawing compulsively. Not the modern, efficient buildings that filled my academic portfolio, but spaces with character and history. Victorian houses with intricate details, structures that told their stories through imperfections. And almost without realizing it, in every drawing I would add the silhouette of a man gazing out at the horizon. The next morning, exhausted but strangely clear-headed, I called Alexander. "I need to clear something up. You said you saw Richard at Rainbow with another man. Can you describe him?" Alexander sounded surprised at how intense I was being. He was tall with gray hair, maybe around 60. They were talking at the bar and it looked serious. "Why? Did you two have something going on?" The description hit me like a punch. Jonathan, the gossipy neighbor who had been spreading rumors about us. Richard wasn't on a romantic date. He was probably confronting Jonathan about the circulating gossip. I thanked Alexander quickly and hung up, feeling sick with my own insecurity and doubt. I'd run off based on an assumption, projecting my own fears onto Richard's actions. Over the next few hours, locked in my room while my dad made business calls downstairs, I replayed every moment with Richard in my mind. His words, his gestures, the way he looked at me, not as Daniel Evans' prodigy, but as Scott, someone with his own vision and worth. By dusk, I'd made up my mind. I sent a short message. "The person you think I am and the person I think you are. Can we give them a chance? I'll be at the lookout at sunset tomorrow." I left a note for my dad about a study trip to Boulder to supplement my research on architectural preservation, grabbed my backpack, and caught the last bus of the day. I arrived in Boulder the next morning with my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if Richard would see my message, if he'd show up, or if I'd burned our bridge for good. I spent the day wandering around town, revisiting places we'd discovered together. The Victorian house we'd worked on, now with its front windows restored. The corner cafe where we used to grab fresh bread on Sunday mornings. The tool shop where everyone knew Richard by name. At 5 o'clock, I started hiking the trail to the lookout. Every step felt heavy with meaning. Every stone on the familiar yet strange path resonating with memories. I got there 20 minutes before sunset, and sat on the same rock where everything had started to change between us. Minutes dragged by. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in the same golden and crimson hues as that night. But there was no sign of Richard. Just as the sun was about to vanish behind the mountains, I heard footsteps on the trail. Richard stepped into the clearing, his breath still a bit hurried from the climb. He was wearing that same faded blue shirt from our first day at the Victorian house, his hair a bit tousled by the wind. "I came as soon as I saw your message," he said, keeping his distance. "I was out working all day." I swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of what to say. I'd rehearsed a dozen lines on the bus ride over, yet now the words felt so inadequate. "My dad found out about us," I blurted out. "Someone in town called him. Jonathan, most likely." Richard nodded slowly. "I figured this would happen sooner or later. He said things I don't want to repeat. About you, about me." Richard took it all in with a calm dignity that moved me. For a brief moment his face betrayed a flicker of pain before he regained his composure. "I get if this changes everything for you, Scott. You have a whole life ahead of you, a bright future. I don't want to be the reason you break with your family. I ran away," I admitted, each word heavy with shame. I went back to Denver thinking I was doing the right thing, what was expected. But the truth is, I was scared. Not of what happened between us, but of what it meant about who I am. The mountain wind blew between us, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. And then Alexander told me he saw you at Rainbow with another guy, and I thought... My voice trailed off. "Jonathan," Richard confirmed. "I confronted him about the rumors he's been spreading. It wasn't a pleasant encounter. I felt relief and shame mixing inside me. I misinterpreted everything. And then Samantha called me." "Samantha?" Richard asked, frowning. "Your neighbor. The redhead who always walks around with that huge border collie." I smiled, recalling the image. "She said you seemed lost since I left, and that made me question all my certainties." Richard took a hesitant step closer. "And what did you conclude from that?" "I realized I don't really know what we are or can be," I said, finally using the words I truly felt. "But I know I want to find out. even if it means disappointing my dad, facing the disapproval of this town, even if it hurts. Richard moved even closer, raising his hand to touch my face with a tenderness that made my heart race. "It's going to hurt," he warned softly, his eyes searching mine. "People will talk. Your dad might not understand. And there's our age difference, our lives at two very different stages." "I know," I smiled, the first real smile I'd had since leaving Boulder. "But sometimes certain structures are worth preserving, aren't they?" The last sliver of daylight disappeared behind the mountains as Richard closed the gap between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that felt both like coming home and a new beginning. We walked back hand in hand to Richard's house, or rather our house now. Switching my studies to the local university turned out to be surprisingly easy. The tough part was the conversation with my dad, which swung between disbelief, anger, and finally the reluctant acceptance that still isn't full-blown support. "He needs time," Richard said after I hung up following yet another tense call with my dad. "You dismantled an entire life plan in just a few weeks. Tonight, 6 months after that very first sunset at the lookout, we sit on the porch watching the lights of Boulder twinkle below us like earthly stars. The air is cold, but comforting under the shared blanket. Do you know what I thought when I moved up here?" Richard mused, his arm around my shoulders. "I thought I'd finally found my place, alone, restoring the past and keeping the world at bay. Then you came along, perfectly disrupting my neat life, questioning all my certainties, and shattering your peace of mind," I added with a smile. "No," he said softly, kissing my temple. "You made me realize that I hadn't really built a home, but a fortress. I was busy preserving old buildings while letting my own life get stuck in the past." I intertwined my fingers with his, noticing the contrast between our hands. His, weathered by years of hard work, calloused and strong. Mine, still relatively soft and streaked with paint. "And I've always chased approval, following a path drawn by someone else," I confessed. "I needed someone to really see me in order to find the courage to chart my own course. It hasn't been easy. This small town is exactly what we expected. Some people support us, like Samantha. Others still give us looks of barely concealed disapproval. My dad still calls, but our conversations are now cautious and polite, far removed from the closeness we once had. But there have been unexpected joys too. The Victorian house we restored together won a historical preservation award. My architecture projects, now filled with a respect for history I learned from Richard, caught the eye of a firm that specializes in urban revitalization. Not the corporate future my dad had planned, but one that fires me up. Richard even reconnected with old friends he'd distanced himself from during his years of isolation. Last month, we hosted our first formal dinner as a couple, and the house was filled with laughter and music late into the night. "Sometimes I wonder," I say as I watch the crescent moon hang over the mountains, "if your friend ever knew what could really happen when he suggested I stay here." Richard laughs, a deep, comforting laugh as he wraps an arm around my shoulders. Daniel certainly didn't expect this, but maybe, deep down, he knew we needed to meet. To show you who I really am? To show each other who we can be. The wind picks up, bringing the first hints of winter. Soon we'll have to go back inside, stoke the fire in the hearth, and prepare dinner in a kitchen that now bears my own touches. Cookbooks on the shelf, fresh herbs on the windowsill, and that professional knife set Richard gave me for my birthday. I know challenges lie ahead. The distance with my dad, the judgmental stares in Boulder, and the practical issues of our different life stages. I'll have to prove myself in a field where the Evans name once opened doors that I now need to open on my own. Richard, too, has his struggles. Learning to share his space and decisions after years of being on his own. Dealing with friendships that have been lost because of our relationship. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, he admits the fear that one day I might want someone younger, with fewer life stories. But right now, here in the house we share, we've found something rare. A place of mutual acceptance where we can be our true selves without feeling the need to justify or apologize. Sometimes the best restoration project is the one we do on ourselves, Richard says, kissing my forehead. I smile and lean back against his steady, familiar body. And it's an ongoing project, isn't it? Never really finished. Never finished, he agrees. Just a constant uncovering of new layers, revealing hidden beauty a little more every day. My dad's friend showed me who I am, not by instructing me or giving me advice, but by giving me a space to discover my own truth. The Boulder Mountains were just the backdrop. The real journey happened inside me, peeling away layers of expectations, restoring neglected parts of my identity, and laying down a true foundation for the future. If you've ever felt torn between what others expect and what you really desire, know you're not alone. The courage to live authentically isn't an overnight thing, but a collection of small, truthful moments that add up to a life that's truly yours. Leave your like if this story touched you, subscribe for more reflections on personal discovery, and drop a comment. Have you ever had the courage to choose your own path even when everyone expected otherwise?